All right. I'm Ben Burgis. This gives them an argument. I am joined once again by returning guest Norm Finkelstein, author of "I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It," where he has a chapter where he talks about the woman who was just on screen, Robin DiAngelo, and I thought it might be interesting to get him on for his thoughts because it looks like yet another one of these people has fallen. DiAngelo has been facing accusations of plagiarism. It's been in the news the last week. So how are you doing today, Norm?
I'm doing fine. I have to confess that the Robin DiAngelo chapter is my favorite in the book. It's
Yes.
it's totally unscholarly. Well, you cannot actually have a scholarly discussion about Robin DiAngelo. That's like having a scholarly discussion on Knucklehead Smith. It just doesn't fly. But it is a subject of ample. It's a rich load of mockery for something that's just totally preposterous. I have to say, this whole notion that she's fighting racism, or as she calls it, interrupting racism. I'm not quite sure what that means.
Well, it's
Um,
it's, it's interesting because it's like almost the terminology of like tech entrepreneurs who talk about like disrupted industries.
I'm not familiar with that terminology, but I was taken aback when I saw this expression, which is apparently a commonplace in that particular milieu of white lunatics about interrupting racism. Um, it's, in a moment's reflection, this stuff is just so utterly vacuous, as is Robin DiAngelo, the person, that you have to ask what's the obvious question, namely, what accounts for its traction? It was striking to me that, as you know, Ibram X. Kendi had his travails about a half year to a year ago when questions were raised about his financial stewardship of his anti racist center at Boston University. And it was striking then, and it's again striking with Robin DiAngelo, how quickly the New York Times, woke central, rose to both of their defenses. So, about, I would say, maybe 3 months ago, the New York Times ran this interminable article in the magazine section on Ibram X. Kendi. And at that point, Kendi was he was in the doggy house,
Mm-hmm.
and Times was obviously committed to resurrecting his reputation. What was most striking about the Times article on Kendi was when you talk about a person who is reputed to be a scholar, the very first thing anybody does in the academic world is you solicit the opinions of other scholars.
Right.
How do you rate his scholarship? What contributions has he made? What are your criticisms? Well, the Times runs this utterly interminable article. I confess to not having gotten through more than half. And they ask one obscure sociologist who they just describe as an academic or as a sociologist, I forgot which, her opinion of his scholarship. Otherwise, we read about his handkerchiefs, we learn about his smiles, we learn about how engaging or non engaging he is. But there's no discussion whatsoever of his scholarship. The woman who wrote um, the article, I gathered, had her MA in art history from Harvard. Why do you ask an MA in art history? The answer is perfectly obvious. They're not interested in this scholarship. This is all a shtick. And it's the same thing with Robin DiAngelo when the plagiarism charges came out. Frankly, I think the whole field is so completely bankrupt that I don't much care who she plagiarized, because they're all completely vacuous. But the Times immediately rose to her defense again. If you look at the Times article on DiAngelo's plagiarism, oh, it's not so significant. Oh, really? It's not so significant. Now, here is a very obvious comparison. So, the New York Times, as you know, is woke central. It's it's been transformed into a kind of tabloid newspaper, and its mascot is wokeism. So we had the case of Claudine Gay at Harvard. Okay, so she was charged with plagiarism. Now, it was a very interesting moment. The attacks that occurred in that period was the most spectacular assault on academic freedom in American history. There's never been anything like it. Now, I will grant there was the McCarthy period, but the McCarthy period was an assault on academic freedom by the state. It was a politically organized, orchestrated campaign. This is something altogether different. These were private entities, people like William Bill Ackman, who decided that because they're billionaires, it's their right to decide who will be president of Harvard, who will be president of University of Pennsylvania, who will be president of Columbia University. And by the end, the final reckoning, I'm leaving aside those presidents who weren't unseated, people like the Brown University president who came under assault by Sternlich. But by the end, not one, not two, but three Ivy League presidents had been deposed.
Yeah, and there was an element of the state. I mean, there were congressional hearings,
Yeah,
but you're right. It was driven by the billionaires.
Yes, totally agree with what you just said. But here's the thing: the Times didn't protest that. They didn't protest that Claudine Gay was obviously being deposed because she was insufficiently repressive of the anti genocide movement on the college campus. They didn't protest that. They didn't say these charges of plagiarism are completely so trivial. I mean, in the case of Claudine Gay, at least she plagiarized serious scholarly work. No, really, that's to her credit. If you remember, later, Bill Ackman's wife came under attack for her plagiarism, and she got her degree from MIT, and she plagiarized Wikipedia.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. If you're going to plagiarize, you should, at least plagiarize something real. Yeah. I mean, I do think that at the time, I did see some people trying to argue that the Claudine Gay plagiarism didn't really matter because it was relatively trivial, or because, the sort of field that she was in, that writing doesn't matter that much, or et cetera. And I was never very convinced by all that. I thought it's like, no, clearly she did something that if like a student of mine did that, they would fail the class, right? I mean, like they should. But at the same time, I mean, I think you can cope, I think you can have room for both of these, right? Like, it was pretty clear that the motivation for going after Claudine Gay was not really a sudden upsurge of passion about academic standards. It was that, as you say, she didn't repress, student protesters, with like enough ferocity or quickly enough to, to satisfy to satisfy these people. So, I mean, the agenda was to go after free speech on campuses. It just happened that, she had that like her history gave the material to work with.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I'm simply making the point that this wokeism is very selective. They defended Robin DiAngelo. They defended Ibram X. Kendi. But when it clashed with a ruling elite
Right.
interest, in this case Israel, they threw them all to the wolves. I mean, if you remember during that period, this is the era of wokeness, liberal wokeness, okay? So women of color have a special immunity because they suffer from what's called intersectional oppression. That didn't help Claudine Gay. That didn't help President Shafiq at Columbia University. And McGill was a woman at U of P. It didn't help her. When the ruling elite decides that one of their interests is at stake, they throw these intersectionally oppressed women to the wolves, to the dogs. But Robin DiAngelo, who's a certifiable airhead, Ibram X. Kendi, who is a certifiable airhead, but they're useful. They're useful. They're useful for uh, uh, burnishing the woke bona fides of places like the Times because they're totally harmless. They're totally innocuous. They don't threaten any institutions of power. So you promote them and let those people be the spokespersons uh, the spokespersons for anti-racism and the spokespersons for wokeness in general. They,
Well,
they, they pose no threat whatsoever.
well, I want to get into that harmlessness because one of the first things you point out in your chapter about Robin DiAngelo, and I'll burn that bridge when I get to it, is that her, in her book, White Fragility, she why it's so hard for white people to talk about racism, that she defines racism initially in structural terms and even makes a couple of comments about it having something to do with economics. But then her actual solution to it seems to be, I think the phrase you use is it fits very comfortably within the genre of self-help.
Yeah. Um, Let me just backtrack a
Huh.
bit. In my era, when we were growing up, even the era of Martin Luther King and others, fighting racism was something very concrete. It was about desegregation. It was about removing legal obstacles and hurdles to full equality in the United States. In the case of Jews, it meant things like access to Ivy League universities, which discriminated against Jews. It meant access to housing, which was obviously an overlap with African American people. It meant access to elite law firms, which were they were called the white shoe law firms, which were all a WASP. So you can easily gauge, you can easily measure whether or not you are achieving any concrete results. And the rest was, speaking honestly, the rest was pretty much beside the point. Jews never cared about whether they were loved.
Right.
They never much cared if you carried stereotypes about them because everybody recognizes that the mind is so complex that to try to rid it or extirpate stereotypes is maybe a Sisyphean labor or it's one that will take ages to overcome. That wasn't on the agenda. I remember one of the lines I always liked by Martin Luther King. He was at one point, maybe it was at the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, but it was probably a little later. I can't remember the exact uh, juncture,
Mm.
but he was told, well, with all of this nonviolence and all of this disruption, they said to him, that you're alienating white people. And this is not the way to get white people to love you by
Mhm.
carrying it on in this fashion. And King's retort was, for now, my concern is that white people don't lynch us.
Right.
I'll worry about the love thing later. And that was a perfectly rational order of priorities. First of all, the first goal ought to be equality of opportunity, obviously, because that's the main concern. And the second goal is just very elusive. W.E.B. Du Bois, who I spent some time reading
Mhm.
uh, to juxtapose against the Gook of Ibram X. Kendi, when he started out in the late 19th century, he thought that racism was mostly due to ignorance. So he felt if you enlighten people about the facts, that would eliminate racism. Well, that obviously wasn't the case. And then he took a trip to Africa and he said that he suddenly realized for the first time the extent to which the fantastic wealth of Europe was dependent on racism. So now he began to look at the material component of racism. And then when he began to examine the relationship of blacks to whites in the South, and he saw that black people preferred to have a lower standard of living than they would have had if they united with black people. They preferred a lower standard of living so long as they were quote unquote superior to black people.
Yeah, this
Superior,
is the psychological wages of whiteness argument.
exactly. So if you watch Du Bois's evolution, you could see that his notion of the roots of racism become more and more complex. And then it seems he came under the influence of Freud and he started to talk about the irrational aspects of racism, what he called, for example, I'm using his expression, the sex hyphen jealousy of white folks. And obviously, it took the very ugly form of the lynchings on the pretext of there were rapes and so on and so forth. And so when he had to deal with that last component of racism, Du Bois said, that's a very tough struggle. And he really had no answers for it because it has to do with, you know, the irrational aspects of the mind and how you how you master them. And everybody knows from his or her own personal life how complicated that is. To the point, I think it's impossible.
Well, I
Maybe
mean, one thing that really strikes me about that is, that, well, two things, I guess. One is that I mean, even if you think about Du Bois, right, he ends his life as a convinced communist, and presumably, at least by then, he thinks that you know, that fighting for better society would also be in the interests of those, white workers, that they'd been, maybe sold a bill of goods, that the psychological wages, as Newry says in the chat, doesn't pay the mortgage. But also that, and presumably on that view, right? One of the reasons for widespread prejudice, and it's obviously not the only one, because there are, all kinds of prejudices that survive historically for all sorts of strange reasons after you would expect them to. But a lot of it has to do with material disparities, that in every society where there's an underclass that is, doing much worse than the majority group, people convince themselves that it's because they're, genetically lazy or, whatever, right? They tell some kind of story about how to, about why it's actually okay that these people are in a materially worse position, which suggests that creating a more materially equal society might help with that. But then the other thing is, that really hit me again, rereading your chapter about DiAngelo, is that if you wanted people to, to get over racial prejudices and to relate to people of all races, like they do to everybody else, it seems to me that the worst thing you could do is sort of put yourself under the tutelage of this Robin DiAngelo stuff that makes it more or less impossible to have a normal friendship or relationship, with anybody of another race, because it trains you to constantly interrogate every microscopic detail of every interaction for traces of prejudice. That, that if you, even like, you quote things where even not saying racist things she thinks is actually evidence in a strange way of racism, that, that it's if you've been trained not to say racist things, you've been trained to self-censor. If you don't cry when you hear about the death of a black person, that's evidence of racism. If you do cry, then you're reinscribing racism, whatever that might mean. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I guess what she has to say is just so crazy. Everything is, it's. There was a song in my era: "Sugar in the morning, sugar in the evening, sugar in the summertime." And she's racism in the morning, racism in the evening. There's nothing else. There's not much. I don't blame her.
Sure.
It's a good check at the end of the day, a hefty sum to deposit in the bank. But I'll tell you, maybe this sounds a little bit callous on my part.
Yeah.
I don't really care about eliminating. I don't want to get technical.
Sure.
But there's a difference between prejudice and racism. Everybody carries prejudices, and it's possible, in my opinion, to fight them. The only way, my own view, the only way you can defeat these kinds of prejudices is by concrete experience and concrete example. I'll give you an example. So when I'm growing up, I had these two friends, Peter Addisman and Stephen Schlossberg, and they were aspiring Ivy League types. So in my era, if you wanted to be Ivy League, you're supposed to play tennis and golf. Okay, so they start playing tennis and golf. And at one point, we have a conversation, and they say, why there are no black people in tennis or golf? Because I'm talking about the 1970s now. Why there are no black people? They said, because tennis and golf require intelligence. That's what they said. Tennis and golf. Now, nobody would say that anymore, because we've had our Arthur Ashes, and we've had the sisters, Selena. What's her sister's name?
Serena and Williams.
Venus, yeah.
I think Venus and Serena, yeah. So, yeah, and we've had Tiger Woods and so on, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So you defeat that stereotype not in theory, not by meeting in a group chaired by Robin DiAngelo. It can only be overcome in practice and in real life experience that concretely and indisputably, and that's important, concretely and indisputably refutes the prejudice that people carry.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.